Welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 139. Today we're going to be talking about 4 different images which have been sent in for feedback. Anne, Robert, Roy and Rosemary have all sent in some photos, so we're going to be taking a little look at them and doing my best to help get them past our sticking points. Meanwhile, let me know you're here. If we're here live on YouTube, leave me a comment, say hello, just working out here which button to press next. Yes, tell me what the weather's like, tell me you're here, all that kind of stuff. So yes, here we are, live on YouTube, unless you happen to be watching the recordings, in which case make sure you subscribe and click the little notifications button so that you know for next week and future weeks. Also, invite your friends as well. I'm sure as you're a photographer, you're going to know other people who are interested in photography too, and I may well be able to help them as well. So, I can see we've got a couple of comments, a few people in already. Meg says, hello everyone. Sandra, we haven't seen you for a while, Sandra, says, hi everyone from Birmingham, just back from my holiday in Thailand, which is why I haven't been watching for the last few weeks, getting up to date with what I've missed. Well, welcome back, Sandra. Oh, Anne says hello and good morning from Texas. Maggie says hello from Castle Douglas. Roy says, hello everyone from Huddersfield, West Yorkshire. Lovely day here, but cold. Stacey says, good morning, it's been a frigid few days here in Hatboro, Pennsylvania, around 20 degrees, that's Fahrenheit, although rather balmy 40-something and sunny today. John from Columbus, Ohio says hello, and Robert from Texas also says howdy all. Janet B says hello from Ontario, warming up today after a chilly Friday, wind chill minus 25 degrees C, minus 25! Eek. Right, okay, no, that's more than a little scary, that is. Yeah, I mean, I thought -2 was pretty bad. -25, I'll give a miss, I think. Right, so yes, here we are. Like I say, live on YouTube. So what we're going to be talking about today is, well, we've got a number of different styles of photos that have been put in. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with Rosemary. So Rosemary in sent in saying, earlier this week I was out shooting Frosty Vegetarian against a backlight at sunrise. These red blackberry or bramble leaves seem to be catching interesting light patterns and colour. Oh, Rosemary's here, says hello everyone, happy February from Washington State. So yes, Rosemary here just in time. I'm just about to start on yours. So Rosemary was saying, when photographing these bramble leaves, it was fascinating how catching some flare from the sun by lowering the camera position just a couple of inches created 2 entirely different photos. So let me see if I can show you the 2 different photos she had. So these are the just the sort of straight out the camera, not edited photos. So this was one. So you can see here we've got a little bit of backlight. We're catching a bit of light. I'm getting a bit of frost on the leaves and on the bramble, that light coming through and then she lowered her camera a little bit, and here we go. You suddenly get that where the light is now hitting the lens. You're getting this lens flare. You're getting this haze kind of effect happens. So she says, I like the feeling of the lighter, hazier image and did a little bit of editing to make it stand out a bit more. So this then was her edited version of that photo. Is that the one? Yes. No, hazy edit. Ah, no, not that one. Sorry, my mistake. Minor edit. That's the one. Yes. So that's the one she did out of that. She said then, but then for fun, what I thought I would try and do is see if I could make the image without the haze look like the hazy one. And that's the one I've just shown you. So if bear with me, there is right. So this then is the non-hazy one. Sorry, one moment. My desktop has decided to sort of refresh itself and it's closed the folder that I was using. So, which doesn't help at all. So bear with me one moment. I need to go there. I now need to go back to my navigation pane. I now need to re-find episode 130. What's it? And there we go. Right. Okay. So hopefully I'm now back with you. Let me just close that and close that and close that and just double check that I still have a screen here. I do have a screen here. Good. Right. Computers, who'd have them, hey? Right, okay, so where were we? So let's go back. So this was Rosemary's non-hazy photo, but she thought she would have a go at then playing around with the editing and see if she could create something which matched up to the hazy version. And this was, nope, not that one, hazy edit. This was what she created by doing a kind of creating a false haze. Now, she goes on to say, I wanted to try and understand the light, push my processing skills, found it a very instructive exercise to do. However, for all that, she found it was the imitation filtered light doesn't really do justice to the real thing. It lacks the depth and contrast. And basically, what it comes down to is that while she's kind of created a hazy version of it, it doesn't really quite look as realistic as the original hazy, where are we? The original hazy version, or her hazy edited version. Hazy edit? I'm now getting mixed up with which ones are which. Yes, that's right, that's the original. That's the non-hazy one. That's her hazy edit of her non-hazy one, if you're with me still. Right, so basically let's go back to what she's asking. Having found that it doesn't work quite as well, she wanted to know if I had any suggestions to try and make the altered image look more naturalistic and replace the original hazy image. If time allowed, it would probably be a good exercise to try and do the reverse, which is where you actually take a hazy image and you try and make it less hazy. Now, to be honest, that's mostly what people try and do, is they try and do it the other way around. For the most part, if you end up with a hazy image, so you start off with this one, what most people then try and do is actually try and take out some of the haze because you're still lacking a bit of depth. So you want to try and add a little bit more depth to it rather than the other way around. Now, if you are trying to do it the other way around, there's a whole bunch of things that are kind of standard bits. So, okay. Let's take this, let's go to open this in Photoshop. Probably easiest if I just kind of start showing you, because I realise I'm kind of talking around the topic, and if half of you haven't switched off already, I'll be quite surprised. So let's swap that space here. Now, generally speaking, once we've kind of cropped down, we've got the size and shape we want. If we wanted to add a kind of a quick haze effect, one of the things to do would be to on a separate layer, what I'll do is I'll create a kind, you can create a kind of large, let's do that 100%, and create like a large, very soft edge, and I do something like that, and it now looks like there's a kind of a light coming in from that angle. However, the white light doesn't quite look right. So what you would maybe do is you would select a colour that's sort of in keeping. Maybe we sort of go for a sort of slight orange, maybe sort of make it slightly lighter or something like that, paler. And then when I do it, it looks slightly better, although it doesn't fully look right. So we'd need to kind of tone that down a little bit. And you can kind of start to see that it's already giving that haze. Now maybe it's not quite big enough, so I'll just select that and are you going to drag that out? There we go. Kind of drag it out. So it looks, it's stronger up in the top corner and then it sort of fades out. And that then gives you your kind of quick and easy, looking like a hazy, a hazier photo. Now, to try and compare that to your original hazy photo, it isn't going to be quite the same. And there's a whole bunch of reasons. Part of it is that the angle you're at is not just a case of that there's more haze coming in, but if you look at the background here, the background is much lighter because you've gone lower, you've tilted your camera, so you're catching more of the vegetation that's behind it, which is also being blurred out by the haze. And then when you try and start to kind of, well, okay, maybe we're looking into creating a bit more, we want a lighter background over here. We start doing all sorts of things, which then, I mean, ultimately, you can get something to a point like this. If somebody hasn't seen the original, they might think it's natural. But as soon as you compare it to an authentically hazy photo, you realise that it doesn't quite match up. To try and get it as accurate to the point whereby nobody could tell the difference at all, even comparing it to the original, I think probably is... I don't know whether you could... If you can do it, is it worth... Well, okay, let's just say I don't know it to that extent. I think you would have to spend so many hours and so many little pixel pushing. There comes the point of, is it worth it? When actually what you really want to do is, if you want the most authentic, is to get it in the camera at the same time. So if you've already got the hazy version you like in camera, that's the one to play with. I think as an exercise, fine. And sometimes with a photo, you do want to have that kind of sense of a haze blur. And I think something like I've done here, where essentially you create an extra layer, and then maybe with this, like I say, you can kind of, well, let's put it up to full, which isn't natural, but sometimes you can change the interaction between the layer and above as well. So if I, like color burn there, changes it, linear burn, lightens screen. The screen starts to do something a bit more interesting. Lighter color isn't quite right. Overlay, soft light. Soft light gives a bit of interest. And in fact, maybe if I duplicate that layer, and we have one with soft light and one with screen, and then kind of turn that down a little bit, and we get maybe the two of them together give us sort of something slightly interesting as well. So you can kind of play around with that, and I think that's kind of interesting. But once you really start trying to get into the background, I think there's a lot of work going on in there. And you've then got to think, how much is it worth it for this particular picture? I think the other way round, which you were talking about, which is how to dehaze, I think is also an interesting one as well. So if what we do is open your... This is your, I think, the unedited, the original hazy version. How do you, if you've got something like this, but you wanted a bit more detail, a bit more clarity, how do you go about that? So if I duplicate this, and what I'll do is I'll go to Camera Raw. Now, this Camera Raw, in amongst the options here, and it might be the case depending on what program you've got, actually has a dehaze slider, which, as you move it to the left, hazes stuff up more. As you move it to the right, dehazes. And so, but basically what the dehaze is doing is more or less playing with the contrast. Okay, so now if I take the exposure down, take the contrast up, so that I'm creating a stronger, more range between the light and darks. Okay, so we do that without, you see, basically, okay, let me go to the levels here. If we look at the levels chart here, you see there's nothing, it's all hanging over in the middle and over to the right. We don't have deep blacks. So to dehaze, bring that down, and that's kind of what you're doing. You're just adding more blacks, darker bits into where the light bits were. And that then gives you more contrast, and it makes it slightly less hazy. So if you don't want that kind of completely blown out haze, very often all you've got to do is kind of go to your contrast or levels, and so you can do that with your levels, and then maybe brightness contrast as well. Actually, take the levels out, show you again. If I go for contrast, but that's making a bit too bright, so I bring the brightness down, push the contrast up, and you can see you get more or less the same kind of effect as if you've been playing with the levels. So that's the way to dehaze. Hazing stuff up is usually a case of you lay something over the top, or again, actually you uncontrast, but it's never going to really truly match up to the effect of getting it in camera. And if you can get as much as you can in camera, then it gives you more editing opportunities afterwards. So kind of talked around that one a little bit. I hope that's kind of given you some ideas there, Rosemary, of what you were trying to go for. So just close those, come back here, and what have we got? Oh, Janet said we had the fire alarms go off on Friday, so I had to go out without coats on for 20 minutes. Without coats in -25. That sounds horrific. Where are we going? Rosemary says everything is transmitting just fine, even with the computer snafu. Yeah, well, I'm glad it carried on, even though my computer kind of decided to refresh itself. Oh, Andy's joined us to say greetings, folks. April's joined us too, says hello, everyone. Just woke up yesterday in the teens, today in the 40s. Of course, that's Fahrenheit again. Meg says, I really like the different curves in the twigs and the orange of the leaves. And the photo really works well. And Rosemary says, thanks, Meg. Oh, and I always forgot about changing how layers interact. Thanks for the reminder. It helps so much to hear how the sliders work and to play with them to make that learning sink in. Excellent. Right, good to hear that. So, thank you for sending that one in, Rosemary. Meanwhile, just a wee reminder here, if you find these podcasts useful, interesting or entertaining and you would like to support them in some way, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. Another way you can do it is invite your friends along as well. Like I was starting to say earlier, I'm sure most of you as photographers have photography friends as well, who may be also interested in getting a little bit of feedback on their photos to improve. So drag them along to the podcast too. Right, okay, where are we? Let's move on. So next up we have Roy. Now, Roy in Yorkshire, where are you, Roy? Roy sent in this photo and said, this photo was taken in the last few days at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park to test a new camera. It was as cold as it looks, but obviously not Ontario cold. However, British cold, that looks pretty cold. But is it too blue? And I know what you mean, actually. There is very much a kind of a blue, there's a blue shift to it. That sky's got this sort of slightly unnatural blue to it as well. There's also a sense of, when I look at this, that there's blown highlights here, very much in the reflection on the body part here. This looks like it might have been white, but again, very strong blown highlights. And so, and this stand here also, so this kind of tends to feel it's blue shifted and it's a bit overexposed. So Roy goes on to say, just a bit of further information on the image. It was taken on a Canon M200 compact mirrorless camera. I'm trying this out as I've developed arthritis in both wrists and I'm finding holding the DSLR kit a bit of a handful. It has fewer features than the DSLR, but I think it's better to have a camera with less features and takes photos than one with all the bells and whistles that stays at home. Well, sorry to hear about the arthritis, Roy, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Better to have a camera you can use than to have a better camera that you can't use. And it's kind of where, you know, for that matter, these things, your mobile phone, I think are just brilliant. You know, depending on, you know, the newer ones, you know, the ones that have just been out in the last year or two have phenomenal capability, and some of them do RAW as well. If you're wanting to do RAW, part of it comes down to how are you going to use the images. If you're wanting to blow the images up to, you know, a meter wide and have them, then you probably still having a good DSLR will give you a better quality of image when it's blown up really big. But if you're kind of keeping your images at web size or maybe up to kind of A4 prints or something like that, very often a phone will do the job. But certainly, I don't know the M200, but if you're talking about a more kind of compact camera that's easier to carry, one you can keep in your pocket, that makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, these ones do RAW, I know, because you sent me the RAW version of this. So if I open up your RAW photo, no, that was the wrong one. That's right. Hold on a sec. Cancel that. Where's the... Was it that one? Yeah, that's right. You sent me one RAW photo, then we realised we hadn't quite got this. Oh, you sent me the wrong one, so you sent me another. This is the one. Yeah. So this is the original. Now, what I can see from the RAW of the original is that those blown highlights aren't quite as bad on here. And in fact, now we've got the RAW. If I take this highlight slider and drag it down to the left a bit, we can see that we're getting more detail coming back into the ribs here. We've still got a little bit of blown highlight here, and we still have a bit of blown highlight up here, but we have recaptured more detail by moving that slider down. And what we also find is there's now actually detail on here. In fact, we can even see the kind of the smeared bits of mold and what have you, aging that happens on it. So I would say if you open it in RAW, the first thing to do is, before you do anything else, just sort of see what happens when, well, actually the first thing to do, hit auto, see what auto does. That's usually worth something. Though with this auto, I think this looks like it's kind of taken the highlights are still too bright for my taste, so I would take that highlight thing down here a little bit, and maybe just slightly underexpose to begin with your editing. I sometimes think with RAW, it's usually easier to bring more detail out of the darks than it is to try and recapture detail out of the lights. So when you're kind of exposing, better to expose for the brightest part in the photo rather than to expose for the darkest, because if you expose for the brightest, then at least you're not going to get blown highlights in quite the same way. Now at this point, the blue doesn't look as overly kind of oversaturated in this raw photo. If I open this now and we compare it to yours, this is very, very bright and vivid. So I don't know quite what you did in between opening the raw and look. This actually has the look of a slightly overcooked JPEG. So I think there's maybe place for you to start kind of playing around with the editing. So if we take this in and we just kind of create, you've got more of a kind of square FIP. So let's just sort of do something like that. Maybe just bring that down a little bit. That up a little bit, give us that kind of sort of slight rule of thirds-ish kind of figure on where she is. So here we've got this, and now I think when you come to editing, if we now go back into the camera raw, and if it's a Canon, you'll have this. You should have this. Well, no, sorry. This is Photoshop. You use Affinity, but I do know Affinity has a raw kind of slider play area as well. I think at this point, then, if you're wanting to, you can hit auto again, brighten it a bit more, or you can just sort of play around with your sliders, perhaps up the vibrance a bit if you want a little bit more. Now, the key bit here is depending on whether you're wanting, actually, I'll tell you what, I'll come back to that. First of all, let's just say we want to take a little bit of vignette just to kind of pull the corners in a bit, but not so noticeable that we're noticing it. And then maybe we grab the clarity and just give it a little bit of depth. So we've now got something like this. Maybe this bit isn't standing out as much, but the other bit you were talking about was the notion of the colour. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to make a copy, and that's the too blue or too cold is quite often to do with the temperature balance. And so again here we've got a temperature and we've got a blue yellow slider, and if I nudge it over to the right, you see it kind of warms the picture up, and if I nudge it over to the left, it cools it down with the blues. Now what you can do is you can do two versions of this. So if I drop this into the blues a little bit here, so I'm going to drop that one into the blues, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to filter camera raw, and then I'm going to nudge this one up into the yellows a little bit more. So now we have the yellows and we have the blues. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask this off so that we're only seeing the layer underneath, which in this case is the yellowed layer. But now I can use the white shows what's on the layer, the black shows what's under the layer below. So because this is all black, we're only seeing the layer below. So if I take this brush now, and it's 100%, and I put it to white, I can now start painting the blue layer back in. But maybe I just kind of want to only really have it, say, over the water, maybe over her trousers or something like that, and maybe a bit in the sky. Now it's possible I might feel that's a bit too overcooked, in which case all I've got to do is change the opacity of that from 0 to just nudge it up to a point whereby it feels a bit more, maybe kind of around there. So now what we're doing is we're playing with the contrast. We're playing with the contrast of colours. So we've got the water and the sky look a bit bluer, but the plants, even the dead plants, have got that sort of slightly more warm, and it feels more like a kind of spring day before the leaves go rather than a very cold day. So if you want to shift the whole picture, just take one level and slide it left or right with your blue and yellow, Roy. Or if you want to combine, do 2 layers worth, do a blue layer, essentially a blue shifted layer and a yellow shifted layer, and then kind of combine the layers and paint out the bits where you want one area to be bluer, one area to be colder. And generally speaking, get the water and the sky that little bit bluer, get the plant life that little bit yellower, and it's giving you that kind of nicer colour contrast. So I hope that gives you a few ideas there, Roy. Yeah, so where are we at? Anne says, I like the square crop. It mimics the base of the statue and the shape of the water. Right, yeah, so that's the kind of the cropping in bit. So yeah, so basically there, Roy, I mean, I hope that gives you a reasonable answer on the idea of what to do about the colour. If you feel it's too blue, then slide it to the left, or slide it into the yellow. If that then makes bits you wanted to keep blue too yellow, then use layers and work it in, mask. Yeah, play with your masks with the layers. And the other thing is, which is about your highlights. If the highlights are blown or the blacks have gone too black, really go into raw first and just sort of see what you can draw out of it. You want to make sure that your finished product doesn't have anything that's either too blown or too black, unless you're very specifically going for it and making a stylistic choice and point to do so. As a general rule, you're kind of looking to get your whites so that they're not blown and your darks so that they're not completely lost. Right, okay, Roy says, thanks for that, Kim, still learning to edit in RAW. Yep, I think we're all still learning to edit in RAW for for the rest of our lives, but there's always new things that come along. But yeah, do play with it, Okay, right, okay, so thank you for that, Roy. So next what we're going to do is we're going to go on to Anne. And Anne said, where can I find this Anne's photo? So Anne took this photo. I took this photo over the summer at Saint Chapel or Saint Chapelle in Paris. No tripods allowed. So I way underexposed. I hope to capture enough data to bring it into Photoshop. Any suggestions for editing, sharpness, cropping, or suggestions on better ways to shoot in low light with no tripod? So this is the edited version. Now, Anne sent me the unedited version, which will show you just how dark it actually was. So this is the original RAW file, and we can see now that it is incredibly dark. And you kind of feel that to go from that to that was, you really managed to pull things out. However, when we do go into this and we start looking in, it's incredibly noisy, as we would kind of expect. First of all, you would have been using quite a high ISO in a low light environment, but also because every time we're editing, every time we're drawing stuff out of the darks, every time we've got to make adjustments, we are essentially adding noise, we're degrading the image to a degree. So how do we go about that? Well, first of all, in RAW, I think, if I just hit auto there, it's lightened it a little bit, but it hasn't really done that much. We kind of feel like, actually, I've got to really pull up the exposure here, push the shadows up even more, maybe bring the whites up a little bit. I'm really kind of stretching what I can do to try and bring it into light. And at this point, the noise levels are pretty horrific. So if we go into the detail, let's take down that sharpening, bring up the noise level reduction, and that sort of softens it. But having said that, it's now blurring it as well, because that's kind of what the softening is doing. It's blurring it a bit. However, if we then open that, again, this is one of those things where it kind of comes down to how we're viewing it. Now, you've also then straightened that up, and I think you kind of place that sort of more center aligned then. So can't remember exactly what you did, but so let's just say it's more like that. So we've got a kind of a more symmetrical kind of picture. So at web level, as we're seeing on the screen here, I can click here, that looks fine. I can click here, that looks fine. I can click here. Now, depending on how big your screen is only at this point am I starting to see the noise. And if I go right in here, then I can see the noise an awful lot more. But so if you were to print this up, if you were printing this for a competition that's requiring it printed, the quality here is going to play against you. If you're only using it for online web competitions like Guru Shots or Photo Crowd or something, this will probably be good enough in terms of the quality. Now, then it's a case of whether you want to do any more edits, whether you want to play with color shifts or contrasts or anything else. But that's down to how you decide to personally do it. So really your biggest problem is the fact that you were in a low light situation, and the other bit of the question is, what can you do about that low light situation? Now, part of the thing here is, let me go back here and reopen this. Because here I can now see up in the corner what your settings were. And what we see here is that your ISO 800, so it shouldn't have been too bad. But the problem was everything was so underexposed, we've had to really draw everything up. What we've also got is 1/80th of a second. You've got it at 18 millimeters, so quite wide angle. That's pretty good. But it's f/22. And this here, f/22, is where your primary problem lies. f/22 is a very, very narrow aperture. And because it's a very narrow aperture, it means very little light is getting in. So, the main point here then is, in a low light situation, you're looking to get as much light into the camera as you can. There's not enough light for you to be able to get all the light you want, so you're trying to get it as much as you can so that when you get to the Photoshop stage, you're dragging those sliders as little as you have to in order to bring detail out of the shadows. The more you have to bring them out, the more noise you're going to end up with. Now, first, there's the three different things which interfere with the amount of noise, the amount of light that you're getting into the camera. The first is your shutter speed, and what you've already said is the problem is that you've got down to 1/80th of a second, but you run the risk if you go much below 1/80th of a second. If you were to, given the fact that you can't have a tripod, you're handheld, then you run into this major problem that if you're down at 20th of a second, the sheer slight vibrations of your hand or the slight swaying of a body standing there is going to make the picture out of focus. And then it doesn't matter how brilliant your quality of light is, if it's out of focus, you don't have your photo. So your shutter speed, you're going to try and go for as low a shutter speed as you can while you can still get away with it. Now, without a tripod, you are going handheld. Handheld, 80th of a second might well be it. You've got on your advantage the fact that you're using a wide angle lens. Now, a wide angle lens allows you to go slightly lower before you start getting the distortion. If you're using a zoom lens, at the higher end, the bigger your zoom, the more you're zooming in, the more exaggerated any movement becomes. And to use the example I've used before, if you have a pen, and say I take this pen and I move it up and down like that. Now, at the lower end, the difference between that and that is this much, right? This much. There's not a lot there between that and that. At the upper end, the difference between that and that is this much, right? So the difference between this and this, if you like, in the amount of blur that's going to happen. So if you've got a big zoom lens, and you're zooming in at 200, 400, 600 mils, as opposed to down at wide angle where you're at 24, 18, 10. So you can see then that if you've got a zoom lens, you end up with much more exaggerated. The slightest little movement has an exponential effect on creating more movement blur. But at the other end, a wide angle lens means you've got more leeway. So generally speaking, you've got more leeway before you need to worry about that blur. The other thing that a wide angle lens does is it gives you a better depth of field. Again, if you zoom in, you narrow that depth of field. When you're zoomed out, that depth of field becomes wider on exactly the same camera settings. Now, you're already at wide angle, so that gives you more flexibility with your shutter speed, but it also gives you more flexibility with your f-stop. You don't need to be at f/22. f/22 is going to have everything in focus from front to back, but the fact is, you could probably have got away with an f8 on something like that. You might have even got away with an f5.6. You might even have got away with an f4, depending on which bits you're kind of wanting to have specifically in focus, because you're on a really wide angle lens. But certainly I think an f5.6 and definitely an f8 would have got. Now, if you'd gone to f8 on your aperture, you'd have had a wider aperture, which would have let a lot more light in. And then if you're on your 80th of a second, you would have had the whole picture would have been much brighter than it is. And when we come to the raw, you wouldn't have had to have moved the sliders up anything like the amount to get the same amount of detail. And because of that, you wouldn't have had as much noise to deal with either. Hoping all that lot makes sense. So really, it's that f/22. The fact that you've narrowed down your aperture, that's where your key problem is. Other quick tips for if you're in a low light situation and you don't have a tripod. One is there anything to rest the camera on? Is there a pew, a stool, probably not the font. Is there something that you can rest the camera on so that you can essentially take your hands off and use it as a tripod, so that you can put the thing on a 2-second timer, put it to 1/10 of a second, click go, and then that way you've not got to worry about your own handhold wobbling it. Or sometimes another thing you can do is, if you get the strap, if you've got the strap around your neck, pull the strap out from you so it's really tightening up against your neck, right? And that is going to give you, it kind of creates, it allows your body to be a bit of a tripod. So by putting it tight against your neck, you actually get more stability with your camera than if you're just kind of hand holding it loosely. So that kind of pull it hard against your neck, you might find that you can drop an extra percentage, you know, so you might be able to go from an 80th of a second down to a 60th of a second, or even a 50th of a second, which again will allow you to have more light. Leaning against a pillar, if that's possible, depending on where you are. So you're looking for things to try and make your body more stable. Sometimes even crouching or sitting is kind of allowing you to sort of be fractionally more steady as well. But certainly pulling the strap against your neck will help if there's nothing else to lean against and you can't actually sit the camera on an object. So I hope that all makes sense. A lot of a bit more technical answer with that one, but it's kind of where the answer is for you with that one, Anne. I hope that makes sense. Right, where are we? Stacey says, nice windows from a low perspective. Peter says, a belated hello from Anne, and I'm glad you could make it along, Peter. Andy says, if you can't use a tripod, you can always carry a bean bag and try using it on a fixture like a pew. Yes, I think I've talked before about bean bags. They're really useful. Don't need a big one. I've got a small one up there I've shown before. But, you know, something about this big little bean bag. And they're really good for great for sitting on a gate post or on a fence, or even on the dashboard. Dashboard of your car and things like that. You can, because you can kind of squish your camera and move it, and it will then kind of stay in the right place, and it wraps itself around any uneven surfaces. So that's really, beanbag is always a useful one to have sitting handy if you're going to be in a place where you can then rest it on a surface. But if you can't rest it on a surface, lean against something and pull the strap against your neck. April says, beautiful stained glass. Yes, just needed the light. Rosemary says, that's a stunning stained glass, and what a tricky shooting situation. Meg says, absolutely spectacular photo, and I love the different colours in the building. Anne says, thanks everyone, and thanks to Kim for the helpful explanation. Excellent. And John says, tricky shot, that was more successful than not. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So thank you very much for sending that in, Anne. Hope you found that all useful. So now we're going to move on to Robert. And Robert has, where are we? Now, Robert sent me this photo, and I have to say, I love this photo. I think this is an excellent photo, Robert. The storytelling, the composition is superb. The only thing really playing with this is the problem is light, as in lack of contrast. Right, everything kind of seems to have smudged somewhere into the fact that there's not enough contrast in this. However, Robert says, I am working on black and white, a black and white photo that I took in New Orleans back in 2021. I think it lacks something, and your last podcast got me thinking. So I thought you could give me your take on black and white edits. It is one of my first real street photography pictures, and I really like it. I don't do many black and whites, but I do desaturate using the colour mixer in Camera Raw. I also like to use luminance settings to darken or brighten certain colours. Let me know what you think. So I think really here, like I say, the composition is great. The problem here is one of contrast. And so let's open this with, no, I'll tell you what, okay, let's just, now you've sent me the raw. But actually, I'll tell you what, I've just opened it in front. Let's open the raw. Okay, let's go for the raw, and we can see what the original photo was like. So, what what have I got here? Hold on a sec. I was playing with this earlier, so let's cancel that and get rid of the extra information I put in and open it again, only this time without the extra information. So this then is the original photo, right? One of the other things I will say with this is what I noticed is when I kind of zoom in, there's a really weird kind of funny markings here, which makes me feel there's something's odd being going. It almost looks like a kind of funny paint effect rather than, so I don't know what noise reduction you were using on this. And certainly when we get to things like this, the fingers here, it just looks a bit odd. Nothing quite looks right when we zoom in. When we're zoomed out, it looks photographic enough, which is fine for web, but this wouldn't print very well either. So there's something going on in the noise reduction here. So I don't know what noise reduction program you were using or what version you were doing. The other thing is down here, there's sort of some strange bits. Yeah, so something's not quite worked in the edits. So let's go back to here. We look at this scene. This scene is a fantastic scene. And so first thing I do, if we zoom in, we notice there's a lot of noise here. Now it's 8000 ISO. No wonder there's a lot of noise. Look at the other settings. You've got f4. So you're not really going to be able to go much more wide aperture without losing potentially something. 160th of a second. Probably reasonable. I mean, you could maybe have dropped, it kind of depends on your handheld. I might, personally, I don't like to go much below 160th because of my own hand wobble. Could maybe go down to a 100th. This is on a street, bearing in mind that you can't just whip out a tripod. But I think you certainly, but even that would have knocked down your ISO a bit. But 8000 ISO is very high. Now, what I would immediately do with your RAW is let's take out the auto. It always seems to automatically sharpen at about 45, which gives too much here. And I will bring up the noise reduction a bit. Now, it does make it slightly blurrier, but it's giving us, at least it's giving us something, okay? And so I'm going to click open on that and just see what we've got. Then we've got, okay, this is where the story is. I think your crop was pretty good. What we're looking at is taking out all these people here. A little bit of footprint in the background. It's fine. Stick these two in that rule of, in those thirds. That looks fine. So we've got the composition here. Composition's good. What's great about this composition then is this composition works well on so many levels. I mean, let's just go to the pencil tool again a sec. And so we've got that sort of sense of in the thirds, we've got them both sort of sitting there. There's almost a kind of yin-yang in the fact that this one's sort of curving around this, is creating a kind of directional that way. This one's kind of creating a direction that way. This is also acting as a containment as well. Everything I was talking about a few weeks ago about that notion of containment. You look at this guy, his eyes are taking you across this way. Actually, I'll tell you what, that's way too thick. Let's just narrow this down a bit. The glance of the man laughing, he's looking at him and he's laughing. So we follow his gaze. This takes us this way. This guy's holding a cigarette. The cigarette is pointing us back at him. So we've got that going on. We've also got the curve round here. We've got the curve round here. So in terms of composition, it's pretty much a kind of as good as you can get. We've also got the diagonal of the thing going up here, the diagonal of the paving stone here. So it's not sitting flat. We've got an energy to it. A sense, even though that's it, not particularly moving, just laughing a bit, there's a sense of energy and dynamism to it, which just works really well. So full smug points here, Robert. Ticks on every level for getting a really good composition and a fun narrative, a fun story. You're looking at one guy just, smoking his cigarette, just looking really kind of slightly out of it. The other guy laughing at him. We've got the bottle of Kentucky something or other. Anyway, presumably the alcohol there sitting in the front. So this is all good stuff. Let's come back then to your black and white conversion. And we're back into this old problem of the fact that if you go to straightforward desaturation, it's kind of dull. The t-shirt becomes black. There's just not enough contrast between the skin on the face and the t-shirt and the surrounds, and everything just kind of becomes a bit dull. Also then what's happening here is these shoes are kind of, because they end up being brighter, kind of actually start grabbing our attention away from where we're wanting. So part of this then is, even if we were doing a hue saturation, what I'm going to do in the background here is, let's take the burn tool, and I'm going to take burn down highlights, put that, say, at something like 20% or something like that, and I'm just going to very lightly run over those kind of highlights there, just to kind of darken that down a little bit. And then maybe what I might also do is just sort of, got to be careful here it doesn't start looking a bit too natural, but just very lightly kind of touch down the corners. We're sort of semi-vignetting it in a way, but we'll maybe do more with the vignette afterwards. But what we'll also do, let's take this into Photoshop for a moment. And so we go to here and you desaturate. We take the saturation down, and here we can see we've got this problem of the fact that, like I said, this just isn't the contrast. So really what you're looking for is a dynamic range. So if we look at the histogram up here, you see there's a kind of big flat bit over here. So let's pull this up. Let's make this brighter. Now we've got to be slightly careful. This guy's got a bit of a white spot on his head here. So if we're bringing that up, let's just drag the highlights down a little bit, so we're getting a little bit more detail back into here. Then maybe we want to kind of do that, adding in a bit of a vignette just to kind of pull those corners in. But what we still really want is a bit of contrast. Now we could hit the contrast here. I think we then end up, it's definitely working a bit better, but actually I'm kind of tempted by the clarity tool. Yeah, now we're kind of getting somewhere. Maybe a little bit of contrast, a bit of clarity. Don't want perhaps the shadows to get too, bring the shadows up a touch, bring the whites up a little bit. So we're kind of playing around with these until what we're getting is more of a dynamic range. And so when we compare that to this, so let's just open that with Photoshop as well, so we can kind of place it into the same space. So that's your original, and then this is my edit. It's making much more sense of it. Now, it might be that we've still got a bit too much around. So perhaps if I take a curves level and drag the whole thing down a little bit, but then use the, in the masking, let's just lighten these guys back up a little bit, something like that. So maybe I can just take that down in the middle. So that's kind of drawing our attention. Now, I'm doing this rather quickly, but you kind of get the sense. And I think at this point then, we've now got something which is much more. Now, and then the final bit, if we really want to test this, is let's go back to the levels. And if I click on the levels, and what we see here is we've still got this histogram where there's a big chunk missing on the left. And if I take this little slider and I bring this up to the point whereby this starts to rise, okay, and I bring that up to there, and now we're kind of there. Now, the middle part of this starts getting a bit bright. I might just kind of use the mask here just to kind of take down one or two little bits, perhaps on his forehead where it's starting to shine a little bit. I'll just take down a little bit of the edges, but I can play around a little bit here. But the point is that this is our guideline here, is in the histogram. We want to kind of have this coming up. And now what we've got is we've got the contrast. So you've got all that beautiful composition, that wonderful story, but we've now got that, we've got that dynamic range, which was lacking in your other one. So if we come to here, we can see that the problem is, if again, let's go to the levels. If you look at the levels, half the pitch, it's like half your range is missing. Everything is sitting in the, is in the 2/3 to the left, is in the 2/3 darkest part. You've got about a third of your highlights missing. I mean, in fact, actually, if we just literally drag that up, you can see how much difference that makes. Now, a little bit more, darken down this bit. Again, worry a little bit about what you were doing with the with your noise reduction, but you can see just quite simply doing that makes a difference to your range. But if we come here, we've managed to be a little bit more with it. Now, if I zoom in here, because we've been playing around it, we do still have a reasonable amount of noise in, not as much, but there is a point whereby, again, in black and white, you can kind of get away with a little bit more noise quite often anyway. You still want to minimize it, but there's more leeway. There's a bit more acceptance of noise in black and white, which you don't tend to have with colour. Colour noise just tends to look really ugly for the most part. Black and white noise looks more like grain from old black and white photos, which make this timeless. So this could have been taken, as you say, last year or whatever, or it could have been taken 20 years ago. Might not really look much different, or 40 years ago even. That's the wonder of kind of black and white. But I hope that makes sense to you, Robert. I mean, I really think it is a superb picture. It really, I love this one. I would have been chuffed to bits. I would have been smug myself had I taken this photo. I think the composition, the story, everything about this is a really good street photo. It's just got oodles going for it. Leading lines, containment, but it's about getting that contrast and also being careful about what you're doing with your noise reduction, because that funny painterly effect wouldn't look good if that was being printed up. Whereas this, as I've kind of done it roughly, would be, I think, acceptable if you were printing it. So I hope that makes sense to you, Robert. Right, okay, comments, what have we got? April says, oh, great catch of a shot. Andy says, lovely image, you've captured some great interaction and character. Robert says, thanks for the smug points. Peter says, nice. And Robert says, I don't remember how I got the bad artifacts in my edit. However, I did darken the shoes to reduce the attention grab. Yeah. Right, okay, so that's pretty much us. I hope you found that useful. Next week, what I want to do is, well, we'll be doing more of this. So send me your images for feedback. This is your opportunity to get personalized feedback on your images. You've seen how useful it can be for individuals. Obviously, everybody who's watching this gets something out of watching it. You see what I'm doing with somebody else's pictures, and hopefully most of you are having an aha moment at some point where you go, maybe I can try that out in one of my photos, which is kind of similar. But send me your images. Now, if you are on Facebook, we have a Facebook group called Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Put your images in there. If you don't do Facebook, then email them to me, kim@kimayres.co.uk. Tell me what it is, what your sticking point is, what's problematic for you with your photo, and I will do my best to help. If you are going to email me something, it's also very useful if you can email me an original unedited version so I can give you examples of what to do there, of how to improve the image. And as much information. So it is things like, it was very useful to be able to spot from Anne's photo that she was set at f22. It's useful to be able to spot that, Robert's photo had an ISO 8000. So these things actually then help me to work out how to best kind of help you, give you the information you can when dealing with particular aspects of the editing, or what you might do differently if you were in that situation again. As I said, if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. So do get me your images. Try and get them in as early as possible. The earlier you get them into me, the more time I have to work out a decent solution for you. So I think that's pretty much about it. Last couple of comments here. What do we say? Robert's saying, thank you for your edit suggestions. I will get onto new edits. Excellent. And Anne says, wonderful photo. Robert says, I will be entering it into the Dallas Camera Club next week. Get your editing sorted out. I definitely think it's worth it. I'd be very surprised if it didn't score highly. April says, good luck, Robert, and have a great week. Excellent. Okay, right. So thank you ever so much to Roy, to Anne, to Robert, and to Rosemary for sending in the images. Make sure you get your images. Anybody who's wanting feedback, get them into me as early as possible for next week. And I look forward to seeing you all next Sunday. Take care. Bye-bye.